Have you ever noticed how, many times, the people who seem most loyal in front of the cameras are the ones who betray with the coldest hearts behind the scenes? They say money doesn't change anyone, but I learned in the worst possible way that it only reveals who people truly are. While I was signing million-dollar contracts, expanding my company and quietly multiplying my wealth, the woman I trusted most was building a secret life in another man's arms. And the most shocking part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was discovering who she became when she decided I was no longer enough for the level of luxury she wanted. Maybe you think wealth protects relationships. I thought so too. Maybe you believe that those who have everything never lose anything. I believe that as well. But what comes after the betrayal of a millionaire is not just pain, it's a transformation so brutal that it completely changes the course of a life. And the ending of this story proves that, many times, the one who laughs last truly laughs best, but in a way no one expects. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been discarded when you were no longer convenient, or if you believe that karma always finds its way, this story will keep you hooked until the very last second. And before you watch it to the end, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these stories that reveal how luxury, power, and ambition can destroy, and also completely rebuild, a person. At 25 years old, I was everything many people dreamed of being and only a few actually became. Founder of a company valued in the millions, I walked through glass corridors every day signing contracts that changed destinies. My name began circulating among powerful investors, veteran CEOs, and international funds. I entered rooms where multimillion-dollar decisions were made in seconds. Imported cars lined up in the garage, a driver at my disposal, private jet flights as casually as taxi rides. The mansion where I lived looked like the cover of an architecture magazine. Everything was luxury, everything was abundance, everything was power. But in the middle of that golden universe, there was one single place where I completely let my guard down. At home by her side, I was not the prodigy CEO. I was simply a man in love. My routine started early, often before the sun rose. Meetings across different time zones, international calls, strategies being drawn up while the city still slept. I didn't complain because every deal closed was another brick in the construction of the empire I dreamed of leaving as a legacy. While many spent what they earned, I invested, multiplied, and projected. I lived surrounded by numbers, charts, and cold decisions, but silently saved my warmer side for when I got home. That was where I believed I was safe. That was where I stopped being armored. Back then, I truly believed it was possible to balance love and power. That you could win in the market and also win in the heart. She was always part of my victory speech. In every achievement, in every contract signed, I saw her face as my motivation. I thought of her when I bought new properties, when I closed new partnerships, when I expanded the company to other countries. Everything I built, I believed I was building for the two of us. I wanted to offer her not just comfort, but an entire world of possibilities. Traveling without checking ticket prices, eating without looking at the menu, living without looking at bills. To me, money was never just status. It was a tool to protect the one I loved. It was a symbol of security, of a stable future, of eternal peace of mind. Our mansion was silent, elegant, impeccable. Staff moved with light steps. Everything worked like a Swiss watch. Outside, illuminated palm trees, perfectly manicured gardens, luxury cars arranged like living sculptures. Inside, I sometimes walked barefoot after long days of work, seeking only the feeling of being home. I hung up my suit, placed the expensive watch on the table, and sat beside her believing that was the true prize of my journey. I talked about business, challenges, dreams of expansion. And she smiled, listened to me, agreed, hugged me. At that time, I believed those smiles were real. The trips were constant. New York one week, Dubai the next, Paris right after. 7-star hotels, private rooms, dinners with businessmen who moved entire countries. I always brought back expensive gifts, imported perfumes, jewelry that could buy an entire apartment. Not because she asked, but because I wanted to see her eyes shine. I confused shine with happiness, and today that seems ironic. Every gift was my way of saying, all of this is for us. Every signature on a contract was a promise of future. I thought I was fulfilling the perfect role of husband, provider, partner, dream builder. Even surrounded by so many people every day, I felt emotionally connected only to her. The rest of the world was negotiation, numbers, strategies. She was my human side. I placed her above all suspicion, above any doubt, above any questioning. I never checked her schedules. I never questioned her spending. I never asked for explanations. To me, trust was non-negotiable. And with the innocence of someone who had never been hurt, I believed true love did not need surveillance. I was so busy building an empire that I didn't realize my own home was standing on ground I had never examined. Her social media showed exactly what I liked to see. Photos on trips, sophisticated dinners, designer dresses, perfect smiles. To those on the outside, we were the perfect couple in the world of millionaires. Young, rich, beautiful, and successful. I took pride in that image not out of vanity, but because I believed it represented stability, achievement, and love. It never crossed my mind that this constant display of status could be hiding something deeper. I saw everything as a celebration of our shared victory. I was convinced we were living a modern fairy tale. Today, when I look back, I realize that 25-year-old man was strong in business, but completely vulnerable in the heart. I mastered contracts, led huge teams, made decisions that affected hundreds of jobs. But emotionally, I gave everything without reservation. I believed financial stability protected relationships. I believed luxury was a synonym for happiness. I believed giving everything was the same as being loved. Little did I know that while I climbed higher and higher in the world of millionaires, something inside the person I trusted most was silently beginning to change, and I had no idea what was about to emerge in our path. On the outside, she was the portrait of a woman who seemed to have won in life. Always impeccable, hair perfectly done, flawless makeup, designer dresses shaping every detail of her body. Wherever she went, she drew attention. At the most exclusive events in the city, she was always introduced as the wife of the young millionaire CEO. I saw pride in her eyes when she noticed the glances around her. She liked being seen, admired, desired. She liked the invitations, the flashes, the subtle compliments, and the envy-filled comments from other women. And I naively confused all of that with happiness. To me, she was simply enjoying the life I fought so hard to provide. On social media, everything looked perfect. Photos in sophisticated restaurants, luxury hotels, and international trips few people could afford. She showed off expensive handbags, sparkling jewelry, imported champagne, landscapes that looked like they came straight out of a movie. The captions were always positive, full of phrases about gratitude, success, and achievement. I looked at that and smiled, thinking I was fulfilling my role. That I was responsible for that happiness displayed on the screen. The public saw a fulfilled woman. I saw only my wife enjoying the fruits of our shared effort. At that moment, I still didn't know how to distinguish exposure from real satisfaction. But in our private life, I was beginning to notice small signs that I insisted on ignoring. Conversations became increasingly superficial, laughter more rare, her eyes constantly drifting to her phone. Dinners at home turned silent, filled with uncomfortable pauses. I talked about new projects, business trips, company strategies. She replied with few words, often distracted. I justified everything by telling myself it was routine, that time naturally wears things down. I never considered it could be something more than exhaustion. I never imagined that silence was hiding far more than I thought. She began to show a constant need to be in places where status was visible. Gala parties, brand launch events, gatherings where only influential names were admitted. I funded everything without question. I thought being by my side in that universe of luxury was also part of her role. But little by little, I realized that the sparkle in her eyes appeared more in those environments than with me. At home she seemed distant. Among the elite she seemed alive. I told myself it was just excitement. I never imagined that this hunger for attention could become something dangerous. She started to demand more and more. More trips, more jewelry, more exclusive experiences. Nothing seemed to be enough for long. An expensive gift became ordinary within days. A paradise destination no longer impressed her as before. The bar of her satisfaction kept rising. I worked harder to keep up with that pace, believing I needed to deliver more and more to keep her happy. Today I realize how much I associated love with material giving. Back then, I still didn't understand that there are voids no amount of money can fill. Even so, she knew how to perfectly play the role of the ideal wife in public. She smiled for photographers, greeted businessmen, praised my posture, spoke about how much she admired me. Everyone around us saw us as an example. Friends, partners, and investors said I had everything, business success and marital stability. And I believed that. I felt complete. I would never have suspected that behind that impeccable image there was a restlessness I couldn't see. A kind of dissatisfaction that didn't appear in photographs or at luxurious dinners. Deep down, something inside her always seemed to be searching for more. More excitement, more validation, more sense of importance. Today I understand that she didn't want only comfort. She wanted to be constantly desired, competed for, exalted. She wanted to be the center of attention no matter where she was. And that went far beyond the role of a millionaire's wife. But at the time I didn't give that a name. I just kept working, believing that love was sustained by financial stability and promises of an ever greater future. What I didn't realize was that while I was strengthening my company, something inside our relationship was weakening. I saw distance, but I thought it was a natural consequence of an intense routine. I never associated that change in behavior with any real risk. She kept sleeping beside me, waking up with me, smiling at events. To me, that was proof enough of loyalty. Little did I know that this constant need for status and attention had already awakened glances that should never exist within a marriage. And it was precisely in this environment of luxury, vanity, and the search for admiration that a new character began to approach our story. Someone who seemed to offer exactly everything she felt was missing. At that moment, I was still completely focused on numbers, contracts, and the growth of my company, without imagining that, outside my field of vision, someone was beginning to occupy a space that never belonged to him. It was in one of those luxury environments, filled with golden lights, champagne flutes, and people who lived to be seen, that he appeared for the first time. A man from the elite, well known on social media, sculpted body, flawless appearance, always surrounded by admirers and empty promises. One of those types who walks into a place and immediately becomes the center of attention. I was absent that night, in yet another decisive meeting abroad. She went alone as she had so many other times. And it was there, among flashes and loud music, that our destinies began to be quietly diverted. He approached as if he wanted nothing, just casually, with that trained smile of someone who lives to impress. And she, vain as always, felt chosen among so many other women. That made her feel unique, desired, special. He complimented her dress, her posture, the sparkle in her eyes. Simple things, easy words, but they hit exactly the void she carried inside. While I dealt with numbers, contracts, and deadlines, he dealt with emotions, needs, and vanity. I offered security. He offered excitement. Soon he began to appear in the same places she frequented. Luxury gyms, exclusive events, private parties, rooftops overlooking the entire city. There was always a chance encounter, always a complicit smile, always a conversation that seemed too innocent to attract attention. She told me everything as if it were just another superficial friendship from that world. And I believed her because I had never learned to distrust. After all, who would distrust when they trust too much? He was exactly the kind of man who lives off appearances. Rented sports cars, outrageously expensive clothes bought on credit, followers on social media mistaken for real success. On the outside he shone. On the inside there was no foundation, only promises. But that was invisible to her at that moment. To her, he represented what I, without realizing it, had stopped offering. Emotion, surprise, the feeling of being desired like in the beginning. And so, like a serpent among jewels, he began to infiltrate our world. The conversations began to stretch longer than they should. Likes turned into messages. Messages turned into confidences. Confidences turned into secrets. Everything began as something too small to be noticed from far away. And I was far too distant to notice. While I analyzed financial reports, she analyzed sweet words on a phone screen. While I closed deals worth millions, she opened emotional doors that should never have been opened. She began to get dressed differently when going out. Bolder. More provocative. New perfumes, lingerie I rarely saw. I thought it was for me. Today I know it wasn't. Every detail began to be planned to make an impact on another gaze. But at that time I still saw everything through the eyes of someone who trusts blindly. I never considered competing with anyone. I believed our bond was unbreakable. But without my noticing, someone was already undermining that bond from the inside. The most ironic part is that if I had been present a few times, maybe everything would have been different. Maybe not. Maybe the choice had already been made even before the first touch. The fact is that while I made a point of building a solid reputation in the market, he made a point of building a seductive image in her life. And that, at that moment, seemed enough to completely change the dynamics of our relationship. She began to come home with a different energy. Less talk about me, more comments about interesting people she had met. His name would sometimes appear subtly, as if he were just another ordinary contact. I didn't give it importance. I felt too strong to be threatened by someone who lived only off appearances. I thought myself untouchable. And that was one of my greatest mistakes. While I believed I was in absolute control of my life, the script of my story was being rewritten beyond my sight. A new protagonist was being introduced in silence. And without my being able to imagine it, that seemingly harmless closeness would soon turn into the first visible cracks in the castle that I had been building with so much effort. The first signs didn't arrive like an explosion, but like small, silent cracks. Scheduled changes that had never existed before, last-minute commitments that came out of nowhere, sudden trips that didn't make much sense. I asked, and she always had a ready explanation, soft, convincing. I accepted them all. After all, who suspects their own wife when they believe they're living a perfect marriage? I stayed focused on the company, on the new branches, on the international contracts, while my home began to turn into a territory of secrets. Her phone became an extension of her body. Always face down. Always locked. Always out of reach of my hands. She stepped away to take calls, lowered her voice when messages came in, smiled to herself while looking at the screen. I noticed, but I didn't want to see. I told myself it was all in my head, a reflection of stress, a product of a heavy routine. I preferred to believe that rather than accept the slightest possibility of betrayal. To me, that was impossible. Her clothes changed. The dresses became bolder, the necklines deeper, the heels higher. The perfumes stronger. She took longer getting ready to go out than she did when she went to events with me. I found it strange, but I complimented her. I thought she was just rediscovering herself, seeking self-esteem. I never imagined that all that effort had a recipient who wasn't me. I still believed that glow was a reflection of our success as a couple. The trips began to multiply. Always with different friends, always with reasonable-sounding excuses. Spas, retreats, self-discovery gatherings. Meanwhile, I crossed oceans for work, closing contracts that made my company grow like never before. We almost never coincided in the same city anymore. Our life together started to be marked by rushed goodbyes and mismatched arrivals. I told myself it was just a phase, that later everything would calm down, that it was simply the price of growth. At home, conversations grew cold. She barely asked about my business anymore. She no longer showed interest in my plans, my dreams. I kept talking, trying to keep the connection alive. But on the other side there were only short, disconnected, shallow answers. Little by little, I began to feel like I was talking alone inside my own marriage. Even so, I persisted. I believed love could endure anything, even silence. Touch became rare. Hugs brief. Intimacy distant. I attributed everything to fatigue. After all, our life was fast-paced, intense, full of commitments. I didn't want to be just another controlling husband. I wanted to be understanding. I wanted to be modern, confident, secure. I barely noticed that, while I tried to be all of that, someone else was approaching, taking on exactly the role I was losing. Even in the moments when we were together, something always felt out of place. Her gaze drifted easily, her mind always seemed far away. I started to feel an emptiness beside her, even surrounded by luxury, comfort, and silence. I slept next to the woman I loved, but felt that there was an invisible abyss between us. Even so, I kept going. I didn't have time to be suspicious. I had an entire company depending on me. The contrast was cruel. During the day, I ran meetings, led teams, made decisions that moved millions. At night, I walked through the illuminated corridors of my own mansion feeling that something was out of control. I was beginning to lose command exactly where I believed I was invincible, inside my own home. But I still had no proof, only feelings. And feelings, for a businessman, had always seemed too weak to become a decision. While I reinforced walls to protect my financial empire, the walls of my marriage were becoming weaker and weaker. Something was happening outside my field of vision. Something I could already feel in the air but still refused to name. Until, in a single moment, all the doubts I had swept under the rug would turn into a truth impossible to ignore. The truth didn't arrive like a scream. It came like a whisper that ripped everything apart inside me. It was on an ordinary night in a luxury hotel room during one of my business trips. I had arrived earlier than expected, exhausted, just wanting to take a shower and sleep. When I picked up the phone left on the table, it wasn't out of suspicion. It was out of habit. And then the screen lit up. Messages. Photos. Videos. Fragments of a life I didn't recognize as mine. In that second, the world kept spinning outside, but mine stopped completely on the inside. My body became heavy, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands began to shake. My heart raced in a way I had never felt even in the riskiest negotiations of my career. Every message was a blade. Every image was a blow. Meetings arranged in 5-star hotels. Dinners paid for with the money I brought into the house. Promises exchanged with someone who wasn't me. The betrayal wasn't a slip. It was organized, constant, recurring. It was a parallel relationship built while I was building an empire. What hurt the most wasn't just the act itself, but the coldness with which everything was handled. There was no guilt in the words. No fear in the images. There was intimacy, desire, surrender. Things that had once been ours. I replayed in my mind every moment I had been away, working, traveling, chasing profit and growth. While I did that, she ran into another man's arms. Every contract I had signed now seemed to mock me. Every achievement now felt funded by my own emotional destruction. I sat on the bed in that hotel room like someone who had just received the news of his own death. The luxury around me meant nothing anymore. The elegant walls, the soft carpet, the gentle lighting, everything felt ironically cruel. I was surrounded by comfort and living the most uncomfortable moment of my life. Success didn't protect me there. Money didn't save me from that feeling. For the first time, I felt completely powerless. My mind collapsed trying to understand when everything had begun. At what moment I had been replaced. On which night, which trip, which event I had stopped being enough. I mentally returned to scenes from the past, trying to find the exact point of rupture. A different smile. A silence that lasted too long. A delay without explanation. Everything took on a new meaning. Everything fit together in a cruel way. It wasn't paranoia. It never was. It was reality. I thought about calling her. I thought about confronting her at that exact moment. I thought about shouting, asking, demanding explanations. But something inside me stopped me. A mix of wounded pride, shattered dignity, and a newly born coldness. I wanted to understand everything before acting. I wanted to be sure of every detail. I needed to dominate the situation even if it was for the last time. Because up until that moment I was still the man who liked to be in control. The pain was physical. A tight chest, short breaths, a dry throat. I felt as if something had been torn out of me that I hadn't even noticed was disappearing. I had lost my footing. The future I imagined, the silent promises I carried, the life project I built, everything seemed to collapse all at once inside me. And paradoxically, at that very moment, a new awareness began to awaken. I looked at myself in the mirror that night and barely recognized the man standing there. Not the powerful businessman, not the respected CEO, but a betrayed man, wounded, broken on the inside. Yet, amid the emotional rubble, something was beginning to be born. A coldness I had never felt before. A bitter clarity. A kind of lucidity that only deep pain is capable of producing. In that hotel room, between luxurious walls and absolute silence, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again. I still didn't know exactly what I would do or when I would do it. But I knew one thing. Something inside me had definitively died that night, and something completely different was beginning to take its place, ready to act at the right moment. I did not confront her that same night. I needed a few days to organize not only the evidence but also my mind. When I returned home, everything seemed far too normal on the outside. The mansion was still immaculate, the cars still shined in the garage, the staff continued their routines as if nothing had happened. Only I knew that the perfect scenery was already rotting from the inside. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a rehearsed smile. That only gave me even more certainty that I had been living inside a performance. The confrontation happened on a silent night. No shouting, no broken plates, no spectacle. I simply placed the phone on the table, unlocked the messages and turned the screen toward her. The smile vanished instantly. Her body froze. Her eyes searched for an exit that didn't exist. For a few seconds the silence was so heavy it seemed to scream. I watched every micro-expression. I wanted to see how far her ability to pretend went. There was no more room for lies. She did not ask for forgiveness. And that was what destroyed me most in that moment. Instead of remorse, accusations came. She said I was absent, that I only thought about money, that I had made her feel alone even surrounded by luxury. She said I confused financial provision with emotional presence. As she spoke, something inside me split into two halves. One still felt pain. The other was beginning to turn to stone. The lover, an elite man on social media with the courage of a lion only behind a screen, showed up that same day. He sat in the living room of my house as if he had the right to be there. He looked at me with a confidence that made me nauseous. That was the man feeding off what I had built. That was the man using an image of success while I sustained everything behind the scenes. In that moment, I understood that my pain was also my lesson. She was cold. She said she deserved to live something better. That she was tired of waiting. That she wanted to feel life. The contempt in her words hurt more than the betrayal itself. Because in that moment I realized that love had been replaced by ambition and vanity. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I wanted to beg. But I didn't. Instead, something inside me simply began to shut down. Right there, while the two of them were still in front of me, I felt a brutal change happening inside. It was as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. The pain was still there, but now it shared space with an entirely new feeling, cold determination. I didn't want impulsive revenge. I wanted transformation. I wanted to leave that situation not only intact, but far greater than when I had entered it. I listened to them until the end without interrupting. The more she spoke, the less I felt. I no longer argued. I only observed. Every word she said tore away another piece of the man in love I had been and gave more space to the man being born there. A man who would learn that love without respect is nothing more than an illusion disguised as feeling. At the end of the conversation, I simply said that it was over. No threats. No promises. No scandals. Just one simple, definitive, cutting sentence. That was the last night I slept in that mansion beside her. The next morning, I left the house not only separated, but emotionally transformed. I still didn't know exactly what I would do with that new emptiness inside me. But I knew I would not come out of that story small. Something was being forged in pain. Something that would use that humiliation as fuel. While she believed she was living her liberation, I was silently beginning to draw the first lines of my greatest turning point. The divorce was fast, cold, and worth millions. Expensive lawyers, lengthy contracts, silent meetings in elegant rooms where love no longer had any place. Only numbers. She demanded everything she believed she was entitled to, and I fought for almost nothing except what truly mattered to me, my company and my future. I signed the papers with the same cold precision with which I once signed international expansion contracts. To her, it seemed like a victory. To me, it was simply the official end of something that had already died inside. On the day she left the mansion for good, she walked out like a star. Designer dress, expensive sunglasses, high heels striking firmly against the marble floor. The lover waited outside beside a flashy sports car, the kind that draws attention anywhere. The staff watched in silence, not quite understanding what was happening. And she left with the posture of someone who believed she was rising in life, not someone abandoning everything. On social media, the change was immediate. Photos in luxury hotels, frequent trips, private parties, dinners in exclusive places. She seemed to be living a new phase even better than the previous one. The caption spoke of freedom, new beginnings, and deserving more. To those on the outside, it really did look like she had taken an even bigger leap in the world of luxury. I watched everything in silence. Not out of longing, but out of strategy. I needed to understand how far that illusion would go. The lover showed himself off as if he were a great businessman, a great winner. He posted cars, watches, expensive drinks, experiences that seemed unreachable to most people. But I, who knew how real money truly works, saw something different. I saw ostentation without a fixed address. I saw success without a solid foundation. I saw a castle built on sand. Still, she didn't see it. To her, that was the materialization of what she had always wanted. Status above everything else. Meanwhile, I did exactly the opposite of what they did. I disappeared. I drastically reduced my public appearances. I left social media. I stopped attending social events. I plunged into work like never before. I transferred my pain into numbers, projects, and strategic meetings. While she lived for appearances, I rebuilt the essence. While she spent, I multiplied. While she showed off, I accumulated. Every contract I closed during that period felt heavier, more important. It was no longer just financial growth. It was a personal reconstruction. Did I feel anger? Yes. Sadness? Also. But above all, I felt an overwhelming urgency to prove to myself that that fall would not define me. I turned silence into a weapon. While the world watched her false rise, no one noticed the empire I was building behind the scenes. She seemed increasingly distant from the woman I had known. More dependent on applause, more thirsty for attention, more enslaved to her own image. The lover took her to visible, trendy places, always where there were cameras, flashes, and an audience. Nothing was intimate, nothing discreet. Everything had to be seen. Everything had to be validated. And for some reason, that seemed to make her emptier and emptier, even surrounded by people. Sometimes I wondered if she was really happy or just trying to prove something to me and to the world. But I quickly pushed the thought away. That was no longer my story. Mine was being written in silence, far from the spotlight, inside cold meeting rooms, alongside people who spoke the language I mastered best, the language of real growth. While she believed she was living the peak of her own freedom and luxury, I was preparing to reach a level I had never reached before. A level where there is not only money but true power. And she, without realizing it, was walking straight toward the point where every illusion eventually comes to collect its bill. After the divorce, something inside me changed permanently. I stopped working just to grow and started working to dominate. My mind entered a level of focus I had never experienced before. I woke up before sunrise, trained, studied, planned, and executed without emotional pauses. Every pain I carried turned into fuel. Every memory became momentum. I didn't just want to recover what I had lost. I wanted to build something so big that my past would become irrelevant next to my future. I began an aggressive sequence of acquisitions. Smaller companies being absorbed, competitors being swallowed, markets opening in countries where I had never operated before. The dollar rising, international investments, strategic funds coming in as partners. My name started to circulate at tables where only men who moved billions sat. People no longer talked about a young promising entrepreneur. Now they talked about a shark in the making. And I listened to all of it in absolute silence. My routine became brutal. Endless meetings, different time zones, decisions that changed the destinies of hundreds of employees at once. I became colder, more calculating, more strategic. There was no longer any room for naivety. I learned to play the big game as it is truly played. While some celebrated figures, I celebrated market positions. I didn't just want money. I wanted permanence. I wanted an empire. The numbers began to double at an impressive speed. What used to be millions became tens of millions. What were tens became hundreds. Investments in high-end real estate, corporate buildings, logistics warehouses, stakes in technology companies. My assets spread across different sectors, different countries, different currencies. Diversification became my new shield. I was building something that no emotional storm would ever be able to bring down again. My team changed. High-level executives began to surround me. People who thought in decades, not in weeks. People who knew that power is not built with ostentation, but with real influence. Little by little, I stopped being that young CEO who drew attention because of his age and became someone respected for the size of the decisions he made. The market began to treat me differently. I was no longer just promising. I was dangerous to those who competed with me. Curiously, the more I grew, the quieter my life became. No parties. No exposure. No need to prove anything to anyone. I became invisible to those who lived for appearances. While some still measured success by likes, I measured it by closed contracts and multiplied assets. I no longer needed an audience. The game was now among giants. It was during that period that I noticed something curious. The same people who once ignored me began to seek closeness. Invitations appeared out of nowhere. People wanting to reconnect, to be part of something, to orbit my life again. I watched it all from a distance with coldness and clarity. I had already learned that not every approach is friendship. Many times, it is just interest disguised as longing. Inside I still carried scars. I hadn't forgotten everything. But now I controlled those memories. They no longer controlled me. They only reminded me never again to give my heart without first giving my attention. I had learned in the most expensive way possible that power without emotional intelligence turns into weakness. And I was no longer willing to repeat that mistake. Meanwhile, somewhere far from my meeting rooms and my ascending charts, the world she had chosen was beginning to show signs of instability. I didn't see it, I didn't follow it, I didn't seek information. I simply kept moving forward. But what rises without a solid foundation inevitably begins to shake. And I still didn't know when or how, but I felt that that tremor would soon be heard by me in a much more direct way. The news didn't reach me out of curiosity. It reached me by inevitability. At some point, when my name was already circulating with even more weight in the market, someone casually mentioned the sudden disappearance of that elite influencer. Sponsorships canceled, contracts terminated, debts surfacing like ghosts. The man who once lived surrounded by sports cars and camera flashes simply vanished from the public spotlight. The empire of appearances had collapsed. And along with it, the life of luxury she had chosen also began to crumble. She tried to keep up the image for a while. A few photos still appeared here and there, but they no longer had the same settings, the same energy, the same shine. The trips diminished. The parties became rare. Luxury hotels were gradually replaced by simpler places. The jewelry disappeared from the posts. So did the frequent smiles. Silence began to take over the space once filled by ostentation. But by then I was no longer watching anything. I didn't need to. Reality always finds a way to impose itself. The money ran out. The luxury evaporated. The promises turned to dust. The man who promised worlds couldn't sustain even his own castle of sand. And when everything began to collapse, it was exactly to me that she ran. Not to the lover. Not to the party friends. Not to the followers. She returned to the only place where real structure had ever existed. But the structure that once welcomed her was no longer the same, because I was no longer the same. The first attempt came in the form of a timid message. A simple, "Hi, how are you?" Then another and another. All ignored. Until one day, after insisting, I answered. On the other end, A voice that no longer carried the same arrogance as before. There was no more mockery, no superiority. There was fatigue. There was fear. There was regret. She spoke of losses, of difficulties, of loneliness. She spoke of mistakes like someone who had finally understood the weight of each decision. She tried to meet me. Said she needed to see me. That she needed to talk. That she had been wrong. That now she saw everything clearly. I agreed to meet her, not out of longing but for inner closure. When I saw her, it was a silent shock. The woman who once descended the stairs of five-star hotels now carried in her eyes the mark of someone who had lost everything. The clothes were still elegant but worn. The shine was gone. The gaze was small. The posture shrunken. She cried. Asked for forgiveness. Said that losing me had been the greatest mistake of her life. Said she had let herself be deceived by empty promises. That she had traded stability for immediate emotion. That she had sacrificed a real life for a passing fantasy. I listened to everything in silence. Each word entered me without causing the impact it once would have caused. Where there had once been love, there was now only awareness. She tried to appeal to our history. She spoke of the past, the trips, the comfortable life, the dreams we once had. She tried to awaken in me someone who no longer existed. I watched her as one observes a closed chapter. There was no hatred. No desire for revenge. There was only emotional distance. That distance that arises when pain has already fulfilled its role. She wanted to start over. Wanted to come back. Wanted to try again. But what sounded like a request for love was, in truth, a cry for help. She didn't want me. She wanted the security I represented. And that, in that moment, became clearer than ever before. For the first time, I saw everything with total clarity. As she spoke, something inside me prepared for the final act of this story. I knew that conversation was not just a reunion. It was a closing. An emotional period that needed to be placed. But I would not place it there. There was still something she needed to understand, not with words but with actions. And that understanding was about to happen in a definitive way. A few days after that meeting, I saw her from a distance without her seeing me. I was leaving a corporate building recently acquired by my company, the entire facade made of glass, security around, drivers lined up beside cars worth small fortunes. The sunset reflected off the dark metal of the vehicles, and everything around me breathed power, growth, and dominance. I walked in silence with the posture of someone who knows exactly where he has arrived and where he is still going. At that same moment, she was there, a few meters behind, trying to hide among the people. But I recognized her immediately. She seemed smaller than I remembered. Not physically but emotionally. The clothes still tried to carry elegance, but there was no longer any shine. The face that once looked so confident now showed insecurity, fear, and shame. When our eyes finally met, she froze. For a moment, she seemed to relive everything she had left behind. The luxury car was open in front of me, the driver waiting. I had control of the time, the space, the scene. And for the first time, I fully felt how my path and hers had separated forever. She approached slowly, like someone stepping on a minefield. She said my name with a voice that almost failed. I turned calmly, without haste, without anger. Just with coldness. She began to say disconnected things, mixing apologies, regret, and memories of the past. She was still trying to reach me through what we once were. But that man was no longer there. What stood before her now was someone who had learned too much to ever be naive again. I listened to everything once again without interrupting. But this time there was no doubt inside me. There was no conflict. There was no nostalgia. There was only awareness. She was trying to come back not because she still loved me, but because she was alone, without luxury, without status, without stability. She wanted to reclaim the safe harbor she had abandoned in the middle of the storm. But harbors also close when they are despised at the right moment. When she finished speaking, the silence between us was stronger than any words. I simply looked at her for a few seconds and said, with a calm I didn't even know I possessed, that it had been over for a long time. Not when we officially separated, but when she decided to trade a real home for a stage fantasy. I said that I forgave her, but that I would never return. Forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. Forgiveness is the freedom to move on without the weight of the past. She cried. Not a discreet cry, but the cry of someone who finally understands the magnitude of her own loss. Her hands trembled, her breathing faltered. For the first time, she seemed to have real awareness of everything she had thrown away. But late regret does not rebuild choices. It only reveals the price of each decision. I watched that scene with a quiet emptiness in my chest. There was no pleasure in seeing her pain. There was only the confirmation that my path needed to move forward. I turned, got into the car and told the driver to go. I didn't look back. Not because it was hard to look, but because it no longer made sense. The door closed, the engine started, and the glass building was left behind, reflecting a story that had been definitively closed. As the car moved down the illuminated avenue, I felt something new take hold of me. It wasn't revenge. It was peace. In that moment, I understood that true power was not in the buildings, the contracts, the billions in assets. It was in the ability to not return to what once tried to destroy you. I had lost a marriage, but I had found myself as a man. I had been betrayed, but I had not been defeated. Betrayal had stripped me of illusion, and that, in the end, was the greatest gift I could have received. She stayed behind with her choices, her memories, and the weight of everything that could have been. I moved forward with what I built, with the scars that taught me, and with a future that no longer fit inside shadows. That story closed right there, not with screams, not with scandals, but with the silent strength of someone who learned to say the most definitive no of his life. And as the car drove away, I knew that was the true end of a cycle. There were no more ties, no more doubts, no more room for return. There was only the road ahead, free, wide, powerful. A road I would walk alone but whole, aware of everything I lost, and, above all, of everything I gained by not looking back. In the end, I learned that betrayal doesn't destroy who you are, it reveals who other people have always been. I lost a wife, but I gained something far more valuable: clarity, maturity, and control over myself. Today, when I look back, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude for the lesson that freed me from an illusion that looked perfect on the outside but was rotting on the inside. She lost the man who truly loved her. She lost the empire that sustained her. She lost the life that many people dream of having just once. And all of that for choosing fleeting emotion instead of solid construction. I, on the other hand, moved forward stronger, richer, not just in money but in awareness. And now I ask you, do you believe that those who betray always pay the price? Do you think luxury is worth more than loyalty? And if it were you, would you have the courage to never look back the way I did? If this story made you reflect, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and comment below what you would do in my place. Because the next story might be even more intense than this one.